Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and first of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak to this distinguished group of veterans today about my career. It is quite an honor. But first of all, I would like to talk about a veteran who is very important in my life, and that's my father. That's him down there, somewhere in France with the binoculars, spotting enemy positions and calling in artillery fire. My father only had a sixth grade education, which was very common back in that time for most World War II veterans and people of that time, unless you were especially wealthy and things like that. But he only had a sixth grade education, but he is one of the wisest people I know. And as you probably know, having a degree makes you smart. It doesn't necessarily make you wise. But my father was one of the wisest people I know. And we didn't have really high status in the community, but my father would not kowtow to anybody and didn't back down from anyone. And that was rather helpful when I got in trouble various times during in my life in school and things like that. But let me tell you about a couple of his stories from World War II, because a lot of the veterans of that period, they don't talk much at all, or they only talk to their tight-knit group. But my father, like a lot of them, he had a few little funny stories. Now, one of my father's stories had to do when he met General Patton. Now, that's quite an honor to meet a general like Patton. And my father was involved in liberating Buchenwald, and when the GIs came across that camp, they really didn't know what they had found, because this information wasn't readily dispensed at the time, and a lot of times it was very surprising to the GIs and the military in general. So they were told to preserve the camp until General Patton could come there, because he wanted to see this. So they kept everything in stasis for several days, and my father was standing in front of the camp, and General Patton comes right up to my father. And General Patton says to my father, he says, "Private, where's headquarters?" And my dad goes, "It's right there, General." So that was when my dad met General Patton. Now, some of the other stories, and there were many, but one that is very interesting had to do with this little shadow box he put together. And you notice the little letter opener there and the little wooden shoe. And I've been trying to remember the town. I can't. My dad told me this story. I related it to a few people. Supposedly it was a city in Belgium that had aided the Allies when they initially took the area. Well, they got pushed back in the Battle of the Bulge, and my dad was in 5 major battles. They got pushed back in the Battle of the Bulge. The Nazis took the mayor, lined him up against a tree, and shot him. Well, when the Allies retook the city, the townfolk cut down the tree and made a bunch of souvenirs for the GIs. And that little shoe there and the little letter opener has my mom's name carved in it, Anna. Now, they were a tight-knit group, and that's my dad on the upper right there. And after the war was over, this was at a time, World War II, where if you had any issues, they didn't understand what PTSD was at the time. They called it shell shock, and it was considered a weakness of character. Well, like I said, one of the things my dad taught me a lot was character. One of the guys in the unit had some issues, and this was after the war. And I remember we lived in Iowa City, Iowa, and my dad drove to somewhere in Ohio to be with one of his buddies for a while who was trying to get over some issues and was helping him out, because at the time there wasn't any real government support for that issue. Now, my dad gets out, and he had been a barber before. And some local people talked to him. They said, "Why don't you become a firefighter?" So he did. And my dad spent the rest of his career as a firefighter, went back and worked as a barber for a while until he finally fully retired. And he passed away in 97. And the local firefighters and, of course, the local veterans are very good in decorating the cemetery in honor of the people who served. Now, me, since I was a little kid, I wanted to be a jet pilot. Well, my father was not interested in me becoming a pilot, and especially going in the military. And I had kind of a technical background, so yeah, I became a real techno geek. I was going to become a nuclear physicist. I did a bunch of science fair stuff, but I always liked to fly. And kind of the funny thing was, I went into high school, and the Rogers family in the local community had all been basketball players and had been really kind of basketball stars. And the coach asked me, they called me up and told me about coming to practice, and I said, well, I'm not interested in. I'm interested in scientific type stuff, and I wasn't interested in sports. And they were actually kind of shocked about that. And it's kind of interesting because later, when I was being fitted for a G suit in the Air Force, that's the suit that protects you in a high G environment, they did not have one big enough for my thighs. My thighs are very muscular, and the personal equipment guy looks at me and says, "You must have been quite a basketball star." And I go, "No, I never played it." And he was kind of surprised, and then it kind of made me think, well, I guess I had the legs for it, and I missed a calling there. But that wasn't my interest at the time. I was interested in scientific stuff and technology stuff. Oh, I didn't become a nuclear physicist. I realized that I actually enjoyed building the equipment more than actually doing the experiment. So I ended up getting a degree in electrical engineering. But okay, I'm a kid, and I see the Blue Angels come, and they perform at Cedar Rapids, Iowa in 1971. They were using F4s back then, and Ernie Christensen landed gear up, and I saw the whole thing, saw him punch out, and even though I saw that didn't dissuade me. I thought, well, that looks like fun. I guess that's part of the job. But the thing about military aircraft is there is nothing comparable. I mean, these are leading edge of technology type of aircraft, and it is fun flying. I had absolutely no idea what it was like to fly in an F4. I loved the F4. I had no idea, because that was the fighter at the time. I had no idea what it was like to fly one, but I wanted to do it. And it's one of those things you can't really describe it to somebody. You have to experience, because it is just so wild. The amount of power and the performance is just amazing. And of course, the Thunderbirds. I watched them also. Now, the interesting thing about it is I thought it'd be cool to be a Blue Angel or a Thunderbird. Well, I only had 8 serviceable teeth, and that was the minimum to get in the Navy. And, the Air Force didn't care about the number of teeth. And I thought, okay, if it comes to biting people in the Navy, I'd rather be in the Air Force, where they don't worry about how many teeth I have. So I found the Air Force a little more interesting, and they had a more variety of aircraft to fly. Now, I never did get to fly with the Blue Angels or the Thunderbirds, but kind of an interesting thing. See that F4? That's me down there. That is a former Thunderbird F4. It was number 5. You could, if you looked at the paint right, you could see it, because they basically painted over the 12 layers of paint on the F4 there. But you could still see the stars, and you could still see the number 5. So in the end, I got to fly a Thunderbird aircraft, not flying with the Thunderbirds. And then a little bit later, I'll talk about this later, I got to also fly a Blue Angel F-18. Now, this was quite a bit after I'd gotten out of the Air Force. I had some friends at NASA, and when the Blue Angels beat up the aircraft fairly hard, when they get kind of to the point where they're worn out, they give them to NASA. Now, my father did not want me to be a military pilot. He had talked about the sky being full of bombers and seeing planes fall out of the sky, and just how terrible it was. And I thought he was exaggerating. Well, I found out later he wasn't. So he had a legitimate fear, but it's what I wanted to do. Okay, I got married when I was 20. My wife was of legal age. My parents had to sign for me, but I still wanted to fly. Well, I couldn't afford to fly. There was no way I could afford to fly. I could barely afford to be married at that young age, so I started the Iowa parachute team and started skydiving, because I could afford skydiving, so that kind of was my start in aviation. I used to tell people that I was really scared of flying. I hated landings. I could do takeoffs, but I hated landings. So I had 113 more takeoffs than landings, because I'd get up in the air and I'd jump out of the airplane. I was too scared to land. But then I found out about this Air Force ROTC thing, and they would pay me to become a pilot. Oh my gosh, can you get a sweeter deal than that? So in 6 weeks' time, with 35 hours of flight time, I was able to take my private pilot check ride. And, it's not like now where people spend years and they have to spend big money. The Air Force paid all this. So in 6 weeks, I had my private pilot's license. And of course, like I mentioned, I was in Air Force ROTC. And there was an F-86 from the Iowa Air National Guard that was given to the local airport, and they put it up on this little mount there. And our ROTC project was to paint it. Okay, well, I was in charge of it, and I decided, well, I want to paint it kind of like a Thunderbird because I like Thunderbird. So I picked this red, white, and blue scheme, and I got the paint, and that was our project to paint it. And that was about 55 years ago or something like that. I just kind of covered up the paint that had been the Air National Guard scheme. This was just me. I just took masking tape and taped it. There was no committee. There was no decision. I just decided I thought this would look great because I was doing the project and nobody objected, and away we went. Well, funny thing, this aircraft has been repainted several times, and they just kept my paint scheme that I just pulled out of my posterior here, which I think it's kind of funny. All these years later, that's still how it's painted. Well, you got to be careful what you do sometimes. It can have lasting effects. Well, okay. I graduated. I get my degree in electrical engineering, and it's funny. I had to sign a form that if I washed out of pilot training, they would keep me as electrical engineer because they were short of electrical engineers. Unfortunately, for some people in my class that didn't have degrees that the Air Force liked, when they washed out, they were gone. That was the end of it. They were kicked out. And I talked to a few of my friends just the day before they were out. It was kind of a sad thing because we had gone through so much together. But here I am. That's me in the top center there, and that's my. That's our flight. We're 2 flights, 30 each, and that's in the T-37. And I go through T-37 training, and I thoroughly enjoy it. Man, that was a fun little jet. I just had a great time. I went to the T-38, and I absolutely loved the T-38. And they Air Training Command had their first choice of you. I wanted to go to a fighter, but they basically told me, says, you can put down what you want, but we're going to take you. And if you volunteer, you can get a T-38. If you don't volunteer, we'll put you in the T-37. Well, I wanted the T-38, so okay, I volunteered for the T-38. I'm getting my assignment, and all of a sudden, now I'm in a T-37 as an instructor. Oh, and that's my little son there, who's now a 777 pilot for United, taught him how to fly. But yeah, they put me in the tweet. And I go, what? You said if I volunteered, I'd get the T-38. Well, the class commander, who is a captain, I'm a second lieutenant, the class commander at the last minute decided he wanted to be a instructor, and he chose the 38, and they only had one of them, so rank has its privileges, and I was a T-37 instructor. But it was an interesting aircraft. It has all sorts of bells, whistles, buttons, and things like that. We were the primary trainer. They initially came to the T-37, and we had a washout rate of about 25%. And I worked hard to get my students through, to give them every chance they could get. But as our commander said, you can't fly a 300-knot airplane with a 30-knot brain. And that's what took some of the guys out. There was that. They just couldn't think fast enough to fly the airplane. Some of them would clank, and I'll explain that in a second, during emergency procedures. Others just could never get over air sickness. And, you get in this thing, you get all strapped in, you put a helmet on, you put an oxygen mask on, they close the canopy. Some people actually got kind of claustrophobic. There's a lot of glass there. I didn't think it was claustrophobic at all, but for some people it was. But, it caused a lot of problems, and people, sometimes they just couldn't do it, and they SIE'd, which is self-induced expulsion. They just say, I can't hack this. Or sometimes they were medically washed out. Usually they didn't wash you out for being sick unless it just became totally debilitating. Usually they let the guy pull the plug on that one. But, it was a 25% washout rate. But there was this one student, and this is the thing about being an instructor. I had this one student there, Dan Clack. He was going out to the Fresno Air National Guard to fly F-106 interceptors. I mean, he had it cool. He knew what airplane he was going to get, and it was a fun airplane to fly. But Dan had a big problem with emergency procedures. He would just freeze up and couldn't function. And I worked and worked with him. Really, I could have easily washed him out. But I worked and worked with. I was the Stanavel officer. I wasn't his primary instructor, but I was the one who dealt with teaching emergencies. So I worked with him, trying to get him, so he would calm down. The old saying is wind the clock, count to 3, calm down, analyze the situation, control the aircraft. Control the aircraft is always first, analyze the situation, and then determine what you want to do. And finally, I got him so he could get through the emergencies. I was feeling pretty good about this. And he goes on to T-38s, and he just does great. He's got a good set of hands once he got his mind squared away. Well, I'm sitting out at Edwards. It's later in the story. I'm a chase pilot out there, and I'm reading the paper, and there's a 106 that crashed off the coast there. Edwards out in California, just north of Los Angeles. An F-106 crashed, and I'm reading it, and it says Lieutenant Dan Clack was killed. And I go, oh my gosh. I could have washed this guy out, saved his life, saved his wife from becoming a widow. I didn't. And so that's one of those regrets as an instructors. I don't feel bad about the people that were washed out. I feel bad about the people I didn't wash out and then had an issue. Dan was really the only one that I know of in this regard. But what happened was he was on an intercept. The T-33 is a target. The target is 1,100 feet above the ocean, and if you fly air combat maneuvers out over the ocean, it's blue water, blue sky, very disorienting. And when he broke off the intercept, you want to break up, obviously. He broke down and went right into the water, and there was just no surviving that. All right, there's my son and my wife. This was moments before. That's a T-38 that they had actually chosen from our squadron there out at Vance. And the funny thing was the Thunderbirds went around and they chose the most pristine aircraft to be in the Thunderbirds. And this was one of ours. And so I got a picture of my son sitting on there. This was moments before the crew chief came over and yelled, says, "Get that kid off of there." He's going to scratch the paint. Well, I did my tour out at Edwards, and they were going to put me in a ground job because the pilot slots were not that plentiful. And I said, no. I want to fly. So I finagled and I found this chase job out at Edwards. And I was a chase pilot. I was in current operations where we kind of kept the ranges, the chase aircraft, everything going on a minute-to-minute basis. And the fun thing about this was I was a first lieutenant now. The two people who had had this job before me were both majors. Both were fired for screwing up. And this is the whole thing about it. I never anticipated that I would wash out of pilot training. That just was not acceptable to me. I had no sense of failure. And two guys, much more experienced than me, much higher ranking, were both fired. And it's one of these on-the-spot things. You're fired by the wing commander. And I had no concept of failure, and that didn't bother me in the least. And fortunately, I did fine, and I was actually asked to be senior flight examiner in T-38 Stanavel. But in the 70s, the late 70s, it was an interesting time. Everything was going on out at Edwards. We had the shuttle approach and landing. The F-15, the 16 were all new. They had the F-5 test program, the A-10 test program, and the B-1. I mean, there was so much flight test, it was unbelievable. And here's a look at the runway complex. Now, this is a more recent picture. That little black runway in the center wasn't there, but everything else. And here's a few of the interesting spots. The X-15 test program, there was still some of the structures there. That's the first blue arrow on the right. You move up, and that's where the F-16s and F-15s were. And the final blue arrow there, that's up where NASA had its facilities. And this is a very famous sign. In fact, I think this is in the movie The Right Stuff if you see it, because this was a historic sign. It's now in the museum. Of course, nothing stays the same. They clean it up and they get a nice new sign. Now, I briefed every day at 3 o'clock General Stafford, who was the center commander. And every once in a while, General Stafford, of course, would go on vacation. He was an Apollo and Gemini astronaut, and he would go on vacation. And General Chuck Yeager would come in. So I a few times briefed Chuck Yeager, which was kind of interesting. And basically it was, what happened during the day, problems with test aircraft, and it was a fun job because you coordinated everything on a real-time basis. The test missions would slip, you'd have to rearrange range times, and it was just a very dynamic and interesting job. And of course, out in front of the Dryden, it's now Armstrong Test Center, NASA Center, there is the X-1E. That, of course, the X-1 was the initial aircraft that he flew and broke the sound barrier. And that now is something, well, even the short time back in the 70s, which is only like 20 years after it had been broken, you could go supersonic in idle power in a descent without almost by accident, which I did one time on my checkout. But this was one of the later aircraft that they put a little pedestal out there. A lot of historic aircraft out at Edwards. But it had a couple of things. It was great for the guys. The guys loved the flying, but my wife said if she never sees a Joshua tree again, she'll be happy. And black widow spiders, we had them everywhere. She started out just spraying them. And our daughter, who was 3 at the time, still remembers being told, not to pick things up and being very careful. My wife got to the point where she found stomping on them was a lot more effective than using Raid. And we actually had a base etymologist. We had so many creepy crawlies. Now, the thing about Edwards is you don't want a street named after you. And fortunately, that's not me, because to get a street named after you, you typically die. The streets are named after either very prominent pilots. I used to live on Lindbergh Street, or people that died in flight testing. And one interesting little thing here in my little digression, that's my housing center there. You see that patch there with all those little shadows on it? That's where I lived. That's my house. They had a thing, on the base information thing that talked about people who wanted to come back and see where they lived. And they said, well, if you haven't been back here in 10 years, nothing has changed. And of course, for me, this was the 70s, so we're talking 50 years ago. And like I said, that's my house. This is what it looked like in better times. We had these concrete block with the swamp coolers. Of course, they weren't too bad. They worked fairly effectively. That's my wife and the daughter there about going to ride the bikes there. And there's my blue Malibu. Oh, I wish I still had that car. That's such a classic car. There's another little shot of where I lived, 6868 Lindbergh. There's the backyards. Another shot. And that's what it looks like today. It's all gone. Well, there's my hero shot. I came out and I flew the T-38. Now, I'd flown the T-38 only as a student, but I'm coming back to be a chase pilot. And, okay, I need to get a checkout in the aircraft. And they give you a local checkout. They give you 2 flights. And, I mean, it's a fire hose thing. They don't have any sympathy out there. You're expected, it's not like normal. They'd spend a month training you. I had 2 flights. And the guy checking me out, Dick Scobie. And Dick was a neat guy. He checked me out in the T-38, and I gave him his last Air Force check ride before he went to NASA, because later on in the program I was a senior flight examiner who gave check rides to astronauts and test pilots, which was really good duty, let me tell you. But of course, you should know that Dick was the commander of the Challenger spacecraft, and that, of course, the first of the 2 that were lost, and was a very tragic event for, obviously, me personally, and of course, the entire nation. But the T-38, oh, that is a fun airplane to fly. They call it the White Rocket because it is just an amazing aircraft. And we had a lot of test missions out there. One we had, I'm flying, and I'm a radar target, and they say, okay, we want you to go over Bakersfield, California, which is actually outside of our test area. We want you to fly at 500 knots, do 6G turns and afterburners, because we're going to see if we can track you with this new missile, an AIM-9L, which of course is, long gone. Back in the olden days, you could defeat an infrared missile by going towards a heat source like a city, because it would be lost in the heat sources. But now they had so it could detect somebody that was moving. So we went over the town, and, this is legalized buzzing, and we go, the general really signed off on this? Because if we'd have done this on our own, our careers would have been over. But we're going over town in afterburner, and they're tracking us. And he says, okay, go out over the farm area out there. And I'm watching people, mow their yard and stuff down low. And I'm flying this with Dick Scobie. Actually, we ended up flying a number of test missions together. But one thing about flight test is you have to clear the systems to drop every possible munition, and you got to go through a wide range of speeds, and you've got to cover every possible thing you could drop. So we're talking about just one test mission after another test mission after another test mission, getting data, because most of the time, they do the calculations and it works out well, but sometimes it doesn't, and there are issues. There's some very famous footage of some bombs tearing up the bottom of a F-111. But most of the time, it's not an issue, but everything has to be cleared. And of course, there's the B-2. It has quite a bit of ability. Now, I was back there chasing. I did a lot of chasing of the A-10, which is just an amazing aircraft. The firepower, the weapon systems, and of course there are a lot of the what we call the Mark 80 bombs. They range the Mark 81 through the Mark 84, 250 pounds up to 2,000 pounds. And of course we have to clear these on all the aircraft: the A-10, the 15, the 16. And we had the NASA B-52 out there, Balls 8, the 0008, very classic. This dropped everything from X-15s to lifting bodies. In fact, there it is early on. It's being chased. Now, I was in high school when this was going on, when the X-15 program was going on. And there's a T-38 that I would later fly as a chase pilot. And this is some of the stuff it dropped. Lifting bodies, X-15s, a very classic aircraft. We had test missions where we had to test the parachutes on the F-111 capsule. And later on, we actually, they would drop the F-111 capsule out of the B-52. But at first, they're just doing a basic test with the chutes. And I would be tucked up under the B-52 with a photographer back there getting pictures. They had to test the parachutes on the solid rocket boosters, because those back on the space shuttle, they were recovered by parachutes. So they had this 55,000-pound blivet. And they would go out and they would drop this. Now, Fitz Fulton, who was a distinguished aviator, was flying the B-52, and they went to release the blivet one day, and the little fingers didn't fully release. So they fired the backup system, and it released a little more. So this 55,000-pound thing is hanging on the wingtip by essentially fingertips. They couldn't get rid of it, so they had to bring it back and land. Well, the danger is this thing could come off on landing and tear the wing off. Well, I was in current ops, the command post at the time. We have hotlines everywhere, which is really cool. I pick up the hotline to NASA and said, hey, your chase is getting low on gas. It was an F-104, and I said, he's getting low on gas. He needs another chase. You guys need to send somebody up. 5 minutes later, John Mankey, who was the head of NASA Dryden at the time, he's taxiing in a 104 out. And of course, I arranged with Tower for him to get launched immediately, and went up and chased the aircraft. Unfortunately, they came back, and I watched the landing, and it was absolutely a beautiful landing by Fitz, and no damage to the wing. Back then, the F-16 was early on. This is the prototype, and it was a beautiful aircraft. Now, I understand it's been left outside and is in deteriorated condition, because it's a long time ago. But this was the classic first F-16s. And of course, we did a lot of testing. There's you can see a lot of munitions there, and inboard you can see two little gray tanks. I chased this a lot on a supersonic jettison, 1.1 Mach, 575 knots, and we had to qualify this for a supersonic jettison, and that's quite an interesting program with a bunch of stories in it too. But we also did a lot of high angle of attack work. Now, this was one of the first of all fly-by-wire aircraft, so if you got into trouble, it would get you out. You know, it wouldn't spin, it wouldn't depart controlled flight. Well, I was watching Phil Ostreicher, who was the chief test pilot, go up into this. He was doing cross controls, all this stuff, trying to get it to depart, and you'd watch the flight controls come out as he was getting into a dangerous position. Then all of a sudden it flops over and it departs controlled flight. And I go, I hit the radio and I go, Phil, that wasn't supposed to happen. He goes, no, it wasn't. We need to look at some data. So that was the first instant that, yeah, in spite of the flight control system, you could have a problem. That's what test flying is all about. And we had test cards. Depending on how sophisticated the program was, and by that I mean how much money they had to spend, depending on how sophisticated the test cards were. This was some non-classified missile shots. We had one classified missile shot where the test pilot came and briefed me on 11 test points that I had to memorize because we couldn't talk about them over the radio because the Russians, of course, were listening, and it was just secret parameters of a new missile they were looking at. But we would have 106s that would take off at China Lake, unmanned aircraft, because they couldn't get chase pilots brave enough to do this. Unmanned aircraft, fire a missile at it, and this is, the proof's in the pudding to actually make sure that it does work. I chased a lot of Maverick shots. You may be familiar with this missile. This one was laser guided. They were optically guided, and you could put this thing through a door, or it could take out the turret of a tank. And here's one of the chase pictures here watching the Maverick launch. We went up to fire 3 of them. One actually hit the target beautifully. One started to go towards the target, and it just dove down, and the other one we couldn't get to come up. So it's what test flying is all about, trying to work the bugs out. And of course, the F-15 was brand new, and you can see that by the orange tail there. It was a brand new aircraft, and of course now it's been around for a long time. The A-10 was also brand new at the time, and that's Russ Stewart there with the collection of shells, 30 millimeter shells. The A-37 I flew later. You could take our little shell, and you could hold the round up lengthwise in the barrel of the gun, of the Gatling gun, the GAU 8 there on the A-10. Now, Rusty Gideon was flying a test mission, and he had an issue with they had a group of shells that, they had a little bit of a problem, and he had a gun gas ignition when he fired it. The fireball came back, wiped out both engines. He punches out, but to record data, he has this little tape recorder hooked into his oxygen mask, and as he goes up the rails, the tape recorder catches, and it jerks his head down, and he breaks his neck. Rusty survived. The nurses said it was kind of amazing the good health he was in. That they usually didn't see people in that good of health, suffering injuries like that. This is the crash site where it hit, and went out there to help pick up debris. It looked like talcum powder, and there were just all sorts of pieces of the aircraft. It was just like it was shredded. And they told Rusty he'd never fly again. Then they said, okay, you'd never fly an ejection seat aircraft again. And then I flew Chase on his very first gunfire mission back in the A-10 program, where he came back into the program, and he later retired as a 2-star general. Now, we would chase aircraft coming into land, and what's known as an airborne pickup, where you take off, you come back around, you call them to release brakes, but if you didn't do it quite right, you could get slow. Now, it's kind of interesting. Most people don't think too much about names that are on aircraft that are up on posts. Well, Lieutenant Colonel Strout was chasing this. And he got a little slow and he didn't have the gear down, and he slides the T-33 to a stop in the desert. Well, that's kind of embarrassing. They were about to retire this aircraft for use in the test pilot school, so they put it in the back of the maintenance building, 1600 out there, put the gear down, and decided, well, let's just put it up on the pedestal. And the people restoring it, they didn't mean any ill will, but they decided, well, we'll just put the name of the last person who flew it. That'd be fitting. They kind of didn't realize what had happened to this aircraft. So Lieutenant Colonel Strout got put up on the canopy. Well, that got to be the laughing stock because everybody knew he slid it to a stop and generally screwed up. And Lieutenant Colonel Strout was not happy. And he went in to talk to General Stafford. And, I mean, he was the joke of the base. And he couldn't take a joke. You got to be able to take a joke, okay? He couldn't take the joke. And he was the laughing stock of the base. And General Stafford said, no, it's appropriate. You were the last one to fly it. It's appropriate. And he would not allow him to take his name off it. So the story goes that Lieutenant Colonel Strout came out in his station wagon and ladder, put the ladder up against the canopy there, and took black paint and painted his name out. Okay, well, it comes out in the newspaper the next day, the Desert Times, that the T-33 has been defaced, and so they go up there and they put Lieutenant Colonel Strout's name back up. Now, if he wasn't the laughing stock of the base, he is really the laughing stock of the base now. Well, he's really humiliated, and finally General Stafford says, well, I flew this aircraft back when I was a captain. He finds it in his logbook, and he says, okay, put my name up there. So it now says Captain Tom Stafford. But that's the story of some of the namings, or this particular naming that's quite interesting, of this T-33. Now, air-launched cruise missiles were a big deal back then. They were just starting out, and yeah, that's up next to the B-52 Bombay. You see how close you have to get for these pictures, and we would take pictures of it coming out and firing up. Everything is stowed here. All the tail fins unfold, and the wings come out, and the thing goes on its merry way. So we tested that. And, of course, the B-1 was going on. And, of course, this being a very high visibility program because they were wanting to cancel it, it was, they had better printing jobs. And this is the A model. There were one of four of them. One crashed and a pilot was killed. I've got a video on that. But, it had the boom there for special sensing, getting out in front of the airflow, so you got better pitot-static source sensing. And chased it a lot. Now, this is F-111s. They used the T-38 for photo chase because it was better, but for endurance, they used F-111s. And this thing was amazing. At first, I thought with those four big afterburners, this thing's going to run away from me. Well, it didn't, because the airplane is very heavy. And there's an autographed picture of some of the very famous initial test pilots who flew it. And I chased a lot of the SRAM launches that were, I can't show the picture because it was at a classified low altitude and a very high speed. And I am up under the engines there, farther forward, watching the SRAMs, the short-range attack missiles, come out of the bomb bay and then fire. Now, we also had the O2 out there, and this was a slow aircraft. I had a little bit of time in this. It used as a spotter aircraft during Vietnam War and things like that, but we used it for a chase aircraft. And we had the YC-15 and also the YC-14 program going on at the time. And first time I saw one of these things land and stop, I thought it had crashed because it came to almost an immediate stop. But later they made the C-17. It was take the best points of the YC-14 and 15 and combine them. And I did a test flight on it later because they're looking at putting it into civilian service. We also tested ejection seats for the F-18. And this is, I was doing a maintenance test flight on this aircraft, and the canopy, the mechanic didn't get the front latch tight. Nothing I could detect on the checks I did. And this separated at 500 knots, 0.98 Mach. And I was told, it took my checklist. I thought I had died. Loudest noise I've ever heard in an aircraft ever. And I thought the aircraft exploded, and Bob Hoover later said when I was talking to him about it at one point, he said, I was the only one who's ever survived a loss of a canopy at such high speed in this aircraft. Typically, they were losing them in the P-80s early, and if you're not going perfectly straight, the canopy will come sideways off the rails if it's a very flimsy canopy like they are in this aircraft, and it will decapitate the pilot. So I was fortunate. We had a plethora of refueling tests. Here's one coming up on the 16. We had refueling tests on the B1, the F4, the F-15, the A-10, C-5, because we were testing out a new advanced air refueling boom. You ever wonder how the 15 and the 16 compare to each other? Well, this was coming back from a test mission where we did that. I was photo chase, the F4 was area chase, and the 15 and 16 would go down there and they would play with each other and get the data that is probably declassified. Well, probably not. Who knows at this point. We also had the NASA contingents out there, and I got to be friends with some of the guys, and I got to fly the 104 with NASA. Got to do shuttle approaches to the lake bed. This aircraft is basically a missile with a man in it, and it has a lot of drag. And I would go idle power, full speed brakes, gear, and flaps, and you do 1-360 from 30,000 feet. I flew with the X-15 and some shuttle astronauts, and it was kind of like a shuttle approach and landing, but the shuttle comes down at 24-degree angle. The F-104 comes down at 30, so it's even steeper than the shuttle, and it is scary. I was shown one, come back around for another one, and I asked Bill Dana, I said, when do I start the flare? And he says at 2,500 feet or when you get scared, whichever occurs first. Okay, you talk about air shows. Who gets to have the B-2 at their air show? Okay, this is out at Edwards, and we just have everything to put on display. We had the space shuttle on the carrier aircraft. We had the predecessor of the SR-71, the YF-11 here. And I got to know, one of the neat things about this whole situation is you got to meet and know a lot of neat people. And Bob Gilliland was the chief test pilot on the SR-71, flew all the missions, and just a super neat guy. There's the B1 prototype, the A models, and there is the F-17. Now you go, what's the F-17? Well, there was a fly-off between the F-16 and the 17, and the F-17 lost. But the Navy says, we like that airplane, we want to keep it, so they made it into the F-18. But the prototype was the F-17. And China Lake even had some old F-86s that they used for chase missions. And the shuttle approach and landing was going on at the time. This is where the shuttle would be released from the 747. Actually, it was set up so the shuttle was generating lift, so it actually dropped the 747. So there was reduced potential of collision, because you notice how that aft part of the shuttle is very close to that vertical stabilizer. Not a good thing. And of course, these are pictures of coming in to land on the lake beds with the NASA Chase aircraft. All right, here's a little bit of NASA sex. This is the mate-demate facility. You know, after the shuttle comes in and land, you got to get it back up on the 747, so that's what they do. They put it back up there. And we had a lot of unique aircraft. This is the KC-135, which was the prototype, and they used it for various test missions, and you notice all the windows there. I also got to fly a B-26. It was used in the test pilot school because it had a flight control system that you could tailor to have all sorts of flight characteristics. I'm in the pattern at 200 knots, and I'm saying to the instructor, I go, man, this is slow. They flew this in World War II, and they got shot at? And he said the bullets were slower back then. I go, yeah, right. I mean, I didn't fly 200 knots in the traffic pattern. It was below my speeds, and you know, I got to give it to these guys. I mean, that thing just seemed like a sitting duck compared to the speeds we use now. You know, 500 knots and that. And of course, there's Chuck Yeager right up there, and there's Pancho Barnes right over there in the Happy Bottom Riding Club, which mysteriously burnt down. The structure is still out there. It's fenced off now, but at the time you could walk through it. And one of the early missions was the first jet aircraft, the XB-59. And they actually put a propeller on it to disguise it. Now, my last job was out at Edwards was as a senior flight examiner in the T-38. And when I left, they gave this little rear end of the horse there because they said to do this job, that's what you had to be. Well, they wanted to, as my next assignment, because I'd almost completed a master's degree in aeronautical engineering, electrical engineering, they wanted to put me in charge of the F-16 flight control. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to continue flying. All my friends were getting airline flying jobs, and I decided, hey, this is going to screw me over, so I got out. And they give you a nice little plaque there. And oh, by the way, I was a little cantankerous during high school, and they actually tried to expel me. There was an expulsion hearing, but my dad got involved because they'd already punished me, and they were trying to punish me a second time, and he said, no, you've already been punished. So I hope they buried the nuns face down, because when they later gave me the Distinguished Alumni Award, the nuns, I'm sure, were rolling over in their grave. Okay, well, I get out. I go to United Airlines. I get in a reserve unit flying A-37s. I promptly get furloughed, so I go, okay, I take a job in Cessna flight test. I end up going over to Boeing flight test. Civilian flight test can be interesting. We had a little issue with the actuator, had to slide this 404 to a stop on its nose. And my very last flight at Cessna flight test, we had an engine fire on the 421 that burnt through the cowling, and we almost didn't think it was going to go out. But I decided things weren't looking very good with the civilian aviation at the time, so I took a job over at Boeing. And I initially started out in flight test, and I'd done all this, education and electrical engineering. I thought, well, I'd like to work as electrical engineer. So I went over to the microwave technology group and got hired on there, and got put on this program with the B-52 radar. I developed that thing on the right there called a feed horn choke. It more than doubled the accuracy. It got the program out of a very difficult place, and I was worried that if I screwed up, I'd be fired in 6 months. Well, I was lead engineer in the group and stayed there another 3 years, so it was good that I didn't screw up. I did the placement of all the antennas on the Osprey. That was one of my other little projects, and had a ton of various projects. Most of them I can't talk about. But finally, after 4.5 years, I got invited back to United. I got recalled. I was asked to do a lot of work because of my technical background for the Airline Pilots Association, so I had a lot of positions as National Committee Chairman. I wrote a paper on various aircraft flight control systems and got presented with the Outstanding Paper of the Year award by the Society of Experimental Test Pilots, which I'm a member of. And there's the award there, and I also got selected by Aviation Week for a Laurels Award, so 1999 was a good year. I also was a papers judge at the Society of Experimental Test Pilot Symposium, and sat next to a NASA astronaut, and he says, hey, have you ever flown the F-18? And I go, well, no, I haven't. He says, you want to come out and fly it? And I go, of course. And so he invited me out, and there's me finally getting to fly a Blue Angel F-18. And I never got to be with the Thunderbirds, but my co-pilot going through Airbus training was lead of the Thunderbirds for 2 years. Talk about having a co-pilot who was sharp. So I moved through various aircraft. My last 13 years I spent on the 777. I had the privilege of taking a lot of troops in and out of the Gulf Wars. Some of the bases were secret. We went to Kuwait before it was really opened up for any sort of commercial travel because the war was going on, and I had the privilege of flying a Congressional Medal of Honor winner over to Frankfurt to give a presentation. And I enjoyed the troops. It was just kind of like I was back in the military again. And of course, the young lady there, she's heard about my landing, so she's got her helmet on. And we had kind of a dedicated group of flight attendants that we went on these trips. So it was always the same group. Finally, I get old and decrepit, and they give you this picture, and everybody signs it. They go, hey, get out of here, get out of my seat. I want to move up. So that's my nice little memento there of all my airline flying. And now I tell my stories on my YouTube channel of Ron Rogers, which you know that if you're looking at this because it's on. And I didn't digress too many times, but if you're watching this, there's a lot of stories in there that have a lot more depth, and I really had to brush over them. But if you want to go through mostly my airline video collection there, you can see a lot of these, and of course the military and the flight test and stuff like that. So thanks for watching. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. Thank you very much.